Part 2 of my election video will dive into misinformation, election interference, and some economic analysis with regards to politics. Hopefully you can all learn a few things before you cast your vote. To begin with, what is behind current vote intentions? It is being said conservatives are voting with hope for a better future, while liberals are voting out of fear, mainly of Donald Trump. According to a recent Ledger poll, 76% of conservatives are voting out of hope, while 60% of liberals are voting out of fear. This is the sentiment of almost everyone you talk to. Liberal voters are mostly talking scared about Trump, while conservative voters are talking about a need for change after the past 10 years of liberal government. This one is fact. So why are some voters motivated by fear and others by hope? The fear element that has taken hold is clearly being driven by Trump threats. Is either top candidate more or less likely to cave to American demands than the other? What are the chances we will be the 51st state? First off, immediately the 51st state concept is off the table for most Canadians. Very few Canadians want it, all our political leaders have said they are against it, and there is no way they would allow it to happen on their watch. Anyone arguing otherwise is just fear-mongering, which I'll get to with my next point. Could Canada work more with the US, have actual free trade, maybe even a common currency like the euro? I wouldn't rule out those possibilities, and they would probably have some benefits to Canada, but again I don't see any of those happening in the immediate future. As far as comparisons to and dealing with Donald Trump, we're seeing a lot of criticism of the conservatives comparing Poilievre to Trump because of his bragging about large rallies, him being right-wing, and some of his Canada First slogans and policies can be compared to Trump's America First mentality. As I detailed in my previous video, both Carney and Poilievre are actually just as right-wing, if not more so than Trump, so the idea of anyone being the same just because of their location on the political spectrum is absurd. You've seen swings to the right across Europe before and after the US election. Germany here is incorrectly labeled as left, but the right did win their February election with the far right performing surprisingly well. Constant waves of migrants have overwhelmed all of Europe, and even the most left-wing countries have seen shifts further to the right, which is to be expected since Europe cannot support much larger populations throughout Africa and the Middle East, unhappy with their own countries and standards of living relative to those in Europe. Add in the massive inflation from more left-wing policies such as high government spending as well as the restriction on many rights and freedoms during the pandemic, and it was inevitable to see a rise in the right that has nothing to do with Trump. You can look at economic performance and see that left-wing governments such as Canada, third worst, France, and Germany up until this year, are the worst performing, while right-wing governments of Ireland, Poland and Hungary are the best performing. It's no secret the right prioritizes the economy and economic policy more than the left, and this is undeniable GDP per capita statistics. If that wasn't bad enough though, going forward we've had studies about our projected growth rate showing Canada performing even worse as the last-placed OECD country. You've probably also heard of the recent Policy Horizon government report indicating upward mobility would become very difficult and basically people will remain in the social standing they are born into for the most part, with home ownership limited to those whose parents are homeowners and where wealth is inherited. It also warned basic needs like groceries would be tough to afford for many and that foraging, hunting and fishing on public lands may occur. Of course, I am not going to say that any prediction or warnings can ever be guaranteed with anything in life, especially something with so many variables at play. Really though, are these predictions that surprising? Canada has had almost no growth over the last 10 years. Why would we expect much more over the next 10, or 20, or 30, unless there is significant change? Also, home ownership is already out of reach for many Canadians, food banks are overwhelmed, and the gap between rich and poor is wider than ever, so the 2040 Policy Horizon report is actually just building on the current situation. Canada has done an extremely poor job of capitalizing on our resources, especially the last 10 years under Trudeau, and projections going forward are even more dire. Canada has far too much red tape, political and environmental opposition, some of it funded by foreign interference, as I will discuss later. It is unlikely Canada will be able to unlock even a small fraction of our full resource potential with so much red tape, a lack of investment due to decades of wasted money on project proposals that were denied, and Carney leading as an ESG activist who, while with Brookfield, pushed for a strong ESG image, uninterested in Canadian resources, but fully willing to invest in pipelines and fossil fuel projects in the US and overseas. Trump has said he does not get along with Poilievre, that he prefers the liberal. Trump does not even bother to learn or use names, he just knows our candidates as the conservative and the liberal. There's nothing here in Poilievre pushing a Trump agenda or any of our leaders selling out to the US. Trump hated Trudeau and mocked him incessantly upon his re-election, but to be fair, 80% of Canadians disapproved of Trudeau at that point, and Trudeau mocked Trump during his previous tenure, so for someone like Trump, retaliation was inevitable. While Trump is not calling Carney governor, he did continue to bring up the 51st state during their conversations, something Carney woefully omitted when he claimed they had a respectful, productive talk. In the end, I believe Trump wants to expand the US for the resources and wealth that Canada and Greenland have and to cement a legacy. He has mentioned that maybe he will do such great things for America and they will change the laws to keep him in power past the 2-term maximum, which seems to be his motivations for such massive power grab attempts. Again, there is no appetite for becoming the 51st state, but is there anything else that could tear Canada apart? The more serious risk here is that about a third of the population in Alberta and Saskatchewan say they would vote for independence under another Liberal government, as they feel increasingly alienated from the East and the decision-makers in Ottawa. Personally, I think if a prolonged trade dispute weakens Canada to the point of recession, and Carney does continue the Liberal stifling of our resource sector, this number could increase significantly, with people not wrongly believing they could be much wealthier as a province unleashing their resource sector without federal government shackles. Are we going to see Canada separate or join the US in the next couple of years? I highly doubt it. Is it possible that Alberta, Saskatchewan, and then maybe even Quebec have another referendum on independence under the right conditions? Definitely possible. So we know certain countries have preferences about who our next leader will be, which brings us to election interference. With social media and constant advancements in technology, election interference has become a problem worldwide. We have had confirmed reports of Chinese election interference for 3 elections in a row now in Canada. There have also been warnings of various Indian and Russian interference as well. Although there have been reports on contrasting narratives, China appears to mostly favor a liberal government. Why does China favor a liberal government? While only they could know the full reasoning, the assumptions are to weaken our ties to the US, and that a liberal government would be less confrontational with China, especially after the Trump government's hardline stances. They're probably correct in that assumption. We know Canadian scientists in Winnipeg sent information to China's Wuhan lab, to someone specializing in bioweapons and bioterrorism. To make matters worse, it was right around the time of Trump cracking down on China with tariffs, then COVID suddenly swept the globe. These individuals weren't even relieved of their duties for several years, and it was claimed to be for administrative reasons. And the government wonders why people are always skeptical and suspicious of their actions in cover-ups. Russian motivations are much more obvious. By funding pro-environmental groups, Russia energy companies and the Russian government try to lower North American production, leading to higher prices and higher market share for them. As much as we all want to go green and help the environment, the world is still continuing to consume massive amounts of fossil fuels, and will continue to do so. Estimates vary over time, but Canada has, according to most, the 3rd most proven and probable reserves in the world, yet our production is half of that of Russia. Would you rather it come from ethical, more environmentally conscious countries like ours? Or from foreign dictators funding their war machines? This seems like an obvious no-brainer that really frustrates me. You have to ask yourself, is something in the best interest of the Russian and Chinese governments likely to be in the best interest of Canadians? Then, we have some potential election interference questions here within Canada as well. In addition to foreign influence here, some people are questioning whether we can trust our election process at all. I'm sure you have heard of the Buttongate scandal, where the Liberal War Room itself planned a sabotaging of a Conservative event, passing around controversial buttons meant to seem Trump-like, and to cause controversy and divide, promoting the federal Conservative campaign director being ousted for Doug Ford's Ontario Conservative campaign director. Many people have also shared the video of this seemingly unwell individual stealing Conservative signs. When politely being confronted by the candidate, he just kept repeating "your party is evil" without any reasoning, as he kept on doing it until he was finally arrested. This clearly biased, mentally unwell individual worked for Elections Canada, so you can understand the fear of a fair process occurring by so many. Sign theft is illegal, but apparently occurring on a larger scale and affecting multiple parties than past elections. Mostly the liberals and conservatives are being affected, since they are the clear front-runners. This is an unfortunate problem with no easy solution. I don't think anyone should be basing their votes though on number or size of signs, so if everyone just gets informed of all parties and candidates, then visual sign representation will be less important and impactful. There are also those who are worried pencil ballots will be tampered with and possibly changed. While having humans involved always leaves some potential for anything from human error to willful tampering, but there are systems in place to attempt to minimize any such actions, such as having pairs count ballots with witnesses. Even if there was tampering, the idea that it could be on a large enough scale countrywide to swing an entire election seems highly unlikely. You may have also seen Poilivra's ballot is absurdly long with 90 candidates. This is an attempt by a group looking for electoral reform who had done the same thing previously in liberal ridings and apparently wanted to also do it in Carney's riding but could not get enough candidates. This group seems to be more left-biased and is making it very difficult on those counting ballots, who are expected to take until around 2 a.m. before being able to announce a result. The individual behind the movement himself has run and only received a handful of votes in the last election, as do most of these other nonsense candidates, so they are not likely to affect any outcomes in any way, in this or any other election. It is upsetting for voters and Elections Canada vote counters, but again not an outcome-changing concern. Lastly, with respect to election interference, social media is playing a major role. I can't tell you how much misinformation and bias I am seeing, and this is definitely swinging votes. X is obviously more conservative since Musk swung from left to right politically and purchased Twitter. Then you have Facebook, which is riddled with fake open letters, extremely biased, one-sided opinions, and most worrying for me is the fake ads/news articles. You may or may not know that sharing news articles is no longer allowed in Canada. However, I have been flooded with fake ads, all promoting Carney and the Liberals, with attention-grabbing headlines and claiming to be a reputable source, like CBC, CTV, or BNN Bloomberg. However, if you click on any of the ads despite the site often looking identical to the site they are trying to emulate, you can see the web address is fake. Also, usually at the end there is a scam trying to get money out of readers. CBC did mention they reported some that were taken down as far back as March. But I've reported many that Facebook refused to take down. I guess foreign election interference money is prioritized over ethics, integrity, and user safety at Meta. Hopefully not many people are falling for the financial scam, although we know marketplace and job scams have successfully hit many Canadians, so it's likely this one has fooled quite a few as well. Even aside from the scam, the number of people interacting with likes or comments on these posts is staggering, and evident of how easily people can be manipulated and how gullible they can be, while clearly not reading through what they are interacting with fully with a clear, critical thinking mind. Considering Facebook has an older demographic, and that the elderly are the most likely to fall for misinformation and scams, these type of actions definitely could have an impact on election results. That is very unfortunate and terrifying for the future, as these fakes will only get more and more sophisticated. Lies, manipulation, and fact-checking. There are some rumors that are false, and also some more small lies or erroneous statements by all candidates. You can have a look at this CBC article that elaborates on some misinformation, and there are many more. I have focused on Mark Carney, considering he is the front-runner, has the most attacks against him, is making the most grandiose claims, and seems to have the most statements that are questionable or blatantly untrue. First of all, on the topic of his time at Brookfield. Carney was not yet with Brookfield when they invested in an Abu Dhabi pipeline, joining a couple of months later as vice chair and head of ESG and impact fund investing. He became chairman in 2022 when Brookfield spun off the asset management division and earned stock options currently worth about $10 million, although this value fluctuates daily and there was a significant sell-off as his Liberal Party leadership led to some scrutiny of various transactions. He was still chairman of Brookfield when they began a takeover attempt of a $10 billion U.S. pipeline in late 2024. He also was still chairman of the board of Brookfield and personally signed the shareholder letter encouraging shareholders to vote for a moving of the headquarters to the U.S., which he was caught in a lie about. He stepped down to run for Liberal Party leadership in January 2025. We also know that while at Brookfield he started two funds that raised $25 billion and registered them to a small building above a bike shop in the tax haven of Bermuda. Brookfield is a large, complicated conglomerate, getting more scrutiny lately for shifting assets between their various divisions in order to make financials seem better than perhaps they actually are. There may be some legal concerns, and definitely are some moral and ethical concerns for someone wanting to be Prime Minister. But at Brookfield his main duty as chairman was make money for shareholders, and Brookfield is great at bending the rules any way necessary to do so. There's at least an omission of Trump's 51st state comments, when Carney said Trump respected Canada's sovereignty during a conversation. And he spun the truth saying he helped Paul Martin balance the budget, despite not showing up until 8 years after Martin introduced his first budget, and 5 years after it was already balanced. He also tried to take credit for being the reason Canada avoided the Great Recession of 2008 to 2009. However, in reality Canada did suffer a recession, which Carney himself confirmed at the time. Furthermore, although Canada did weather the recession much better than the US, his role was just one aspect, also helped massively by the Harper Conservative government running a surplus leading into it, and most importantly our large branch banking system that did not take part in the risky subprime mortgages, while lending massive sums to almost everyone who came asking.
What we're going to do is make sure not that the government pays, not that we as taxpayers pay, but the large polluters pay. And so what happens...
But does that not ultimately trickle down?
No, because what the big companies are producing, by and large, are not products that we are consuming. There's some element of that, but by and large, you know, a steel company, how much steel are you using these days, Todd?
Biggest supplier of fertilizer, biggest supplier of aluminum, biggest supplier of semiconductors. We supply almost all their semiconductors. That whole, everybody in the White House is a tech bro except for Trump. They all need semiconductors. They all come from Canada. Maybe they won't. Maybe one day they won't show up. We'll see.
A couple of other lies, or at least very embarrassing statements that show some severely lacking basic knowledge, were about steel and semiconductors. Another odd tidbit circulating the internet with this election: the Liberals are even targeting prisoners, pointing out Poilievre's Conservatives would be hardest on them. I guess every vote counts, but trying to cater to and manipulate criminals is again not a priority I want in such an important election. The apparent obsession with lies has led to many memes with obvious lies pretending to be said by Carney, as well as a pretty funny "This Hour Has 22 Minutes" skit. Humor aside, the magnitude and frequency of the lies are concerning. Overall, it's hard to tell if Carney is a bit of a pathological liar trying to fool Canadians, a large Trump-like ego who in his mind thinks he deserves credit for things he actually had nothing to do with, or if he genuinely doesn't know/remember and these are honest errors. No matter the reasoning, I can't say I like any of the possible explanations in a prime minister. I've seen some comparisons of various statistics under the previous Conservative government to now, 10 years later after Liberal government. Many of the statistics have worsened, but some of these, such as the credit rating, were cherry-picked a bit, where Canada did get a downgrade by Fitch, but other rating agencies kept Canada at AAA. Overall though, Canada has been declining in countless areas. We are or have recently experienced housing, inflation, affordability, food bank, healthcare, mental health, crime, and immigration crises, just to name a few. No matter who forms government, the task ahead will be daunting. I will now put to rest some of the absurd wealth claims out there against both leading candidates. First of all, there were some false AI-generated net worth estimates. Claims such as Poilievre being worth $25 million, and Carney worth under $7 million, have been proven to be completely false, and you can read more about it from many sources including this CBC one. For actual political disclosures, it is fairly complicated. Again, I have linked a CBC article that shows what they have disclosed, but it isn't much. Mark Carney, we know, has about $9.5 million Canadian in Brookfield options based on current market values, assuming he hasn't exercised and sold them, which is unlikely since they don't expire until 2033 and 2034, and he was pumping up a heat pump company recently acquired by Brookfield in the debate, Westinghouse. We also know Carney has a house purchase for $1,300,000 in 2003, which based on housing price appreciation in the city we can estimate about a tripling to around $4 million value currently, which would be in line with the higher-end homes in the upscale Rockcliffe Park neighborhood. The $600,000 mortgage from 22 years ago would be paid off by now or roughly non-existent considering the 25-year maximum and his high salaries over the years. His cottage information is not disclosed, but it's surely worth a pretty penny. I would guess not likely worth as much as his home, but depending where it is and the initial value, that's not a guarantee. His other assets, likely a relatively large portfolio of investments again considering his salaries over the years, in addition to his economics and investment/banking background. I'm sure over 13 years at Goldman Sachs he must have had some share compensation, and we know how well that stock has done after they jumped into the limelight profiting tens of billions of dollars while other banks went belly up during the Great Recession, due to shorting/selling the subprime mortgage-backed securities benefiting from Americans losing their jobs and houses. Now Carney was gone before the Great Recession, but Goldman Sachs stock has increased about eightfold over the past 25 years, so any equity held in company stock would have shot up in value. Although his salary probably rose over time and was a hefty sum for the time, any significant change to his net worth would come from stock and bonuses, not the base salary. Apparently his salary though did allow him to at least pay off his student loans according to a 2021 interview. Then at the Bank of Canada he earned approximately $432,000 a year. Canada was just a stepping stone to much bigger things though, as he moved on to be head of the Bank of England where converted to Canadian he earned $1 million per year for 7 years along with a $400,000 housing allowance and a pension. Carney's wife, Diana, did complain that this was not enough to find suitable housing in London due to the influx of wealthy French after they raised taxes on the wealthy to 75%. Canada's top tax bracket was raised to 54% under the Liberals, yet they still can't understand why all our wealthy and businesses go elsewhere? In the end apparently the Carneys went less lavish and settled on this 8-bedroom house, in a less upscale neighborhood. London is a very expensive city and they apparently had certain high living standards while in Canada, so meeting those same standards even with $1.4 million a year was apparently not easy, but as many citizens and politicians quickly pointed out that amount is 10 times what many others involved in government get in housing allowances, and there were 2 million unemployed Britons at the time. I'll give an estimate of Carney's net worth after I delve into Poilievre's. As for Poilievre, he purchased a $550,000 house in Ottawa 10 years ago, so based on that we can assume he has paid off about 40% of the $440,000 mortgage. He also encouraged Canadians to get into crypto to opt out of inflation. The comments backfired as he was criticized heavily about potential losses for seniors or low-income individuals listening to his advice, as Bitcoin crashed heavily shortly after. Disclosures are required for holdings over $10,000 although amounts are not given, and he stated he had around the threshold at the time. So even though Bitcoin has rebounded fivefold since, that would still only bring that investment to around $50,000. Of course he could have added more, but still not likely to be anything to life-changing in gains for someone currently making just under $300,000 a year as leader of the opposition. He also sold his foreign investments and bought all Canadian ETFs, although again we don't know the values. I did a brief comparison of salaries over their working careers for Carney and Poilievre. Many of their salaries were known with a few missing years I estimated. I did not include their housing allowances or pensions in this calculation. This is a liquid net worth assessment. Carney would have earned around $16 million over his working career, while Poilievre would have earned just shy of $4 million during a shorter career thus far. We have no way of knowing what amount of that they saved, but both seem like fairly savvy investors, so I'm sure they put away a significant amount of their hefty salaries, and that those amounts grew meaningfully over time. Just as an exercise to calculate a complete shot in the dark estimate, I used a 10% savings rate invested at 8% per year, compounded annually. That would give Carney just over $4.4 million, plus his roughly $10 million in Brookfield options, plus his roughly $4 million house completely paid off, and I would take a guess around $20 million as conservative, low-end net worth estimate, with neither including their substantial pensions or other benefits. For Poilievre just over $900,000, plus around $300,000 in home equity, and $50,000 in more aggressive Bitcoin estimates, and I would take a guess around $1.25 million as conservative, low-end net worth estimate. Definitely nowhere near $25 million for Poilivre or only $7 million for Carney. Yes, it is true Trudeau amassed more of a deficit than all other prime ministers put together. This is a massive amount of overspending that even many of his liberal compatriots and his current successor Carney agree was too much. However, there is a bit more than meets the eye. They were exacerbated by the pandemic, which did require additional spending to buoy the economy. Now the spending was done poorly, with millions going to dead individuals and massive payments going to already very profitable businesses that were still doing quite well and not in need, while others in need still couldn't survive. Again though, it was a necessarily rushed process to limit the initial impact, and Canada was far from the only country whose pandemic response was an inflationary mess that gave money even to millionaires and billionaires. Think Kim Kardashian and Tom Brady getting money in the US. Now despite his criticisms, Carney is planning to outspend Trudeau and the PBO estimates, which is a bit terrifying. He is calling this investment though and plans on balancing the operating budget down the road, but we heard the budget will balance itself within a few years from Trudeau's Liberals, and we just saw how that turned out. The Conservative plan also includes some significant deficits to pay for the larger low-income tax bracket tax cut, 12.75% versus Liberal 14%, but being implemented apparently over multiple years, not just immediately according to the numbers. Economics from our big banks are mostly in agreement that both plans are running big deficits, which would still be underestimated given a trade war-induced recession. This is the sad reality of our democracy. Politicians need to promise the world to everyone to gain votes, while assuming best-case type scenarios to make their projections look better than the likely reality to make it appear more palatable. With respect to tariffs, they are far from a US-only issue. Canada has large tariffs on other countries as well. Our tariff documents is about 1,500 pages if you'd like an exciting read. China also imposed some extremely high tariffs on Canada, since Canada imposes extremely high tariffs on some of their goods such as EV vehicles. I'm thinking this was clearly to promote EVs with Canadian content after Trudeau, as well as several Canadian pension plans announced tens of billions of dollars in tax incentives and investments in EV battery plants in Canada. Only for one of the beneficiaries, Northvolt, to file for bankruptcy protection an embarrassingly short amount of time later. It looks as though more deficits that will saddle future generations, with debt servicing payments nearing what the country spends on healthcare transfers, REI, and the CCB combined, and nothing is likely to change that. We are too far gone and headed for a reckoning like the US is currently having, trying desperately to find ways such as tariffs to bring up revenues to pay down some of the debt, or at least cover the tax cuts that were promised to entice the voter base. These tariffs are not expected to bring in anywhere near enough revenue to cover the tax cuts, and their very intent is to shift production domestically, but much of that production could not be done in the US for anywhere near the same cost, and consumers probably aren't willing to pay double the price for an iPhone, or many thousands more for a car, or multiple more in cost for clothing. Plus the US doesn't have enough unemployed population to take all those potential jobs, as their economy is already operating near full capacity around their natural rate of unemployment. U.S. unemployment is still below their 4.4% natural rate of unemployment according to the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, so they don't need more jobs. Meanwhile, Canada is above the high end of the estimated 5.5 to 6.5% range according to the Bank of Canada. In addition, Canada just lost 32,600 jobs last month, the worst decline in 3 years, while the U.S. added 228,000 jobs. Even if everything was moved to the US and they were completely independent, then the tariff revenue would stop completely, and it is highly unlikely any increased tax revenue on that increase in US manufacturing would have much of an impact, plus consumers would have much less disposable income, having to pay more for goods made in America. So the backbone of the US economy, their consumer, would be weakened significantly. All countries have some trade barriers and some tariffs. The US is probably the world's closest example of a free market, laissez-faire society that would make Adam Smith proud. The truth is, the reason for the US outperformance is because they are the modern world's bastion of a free market, attracting investment in their country in both good times and even more so during the bad, as a safe haven. They have also historically blessed these investments with exceptional returns relative to money put to work elsewhere in the world. Here's a little stock chart to show the significant outperformance of the S&P relative to other markets, with the German DAX not too far behind but other countries like Canada, Japan, France, and the UK well off the pace. In addition, 13 of the top 25 companies in the world by revenue are American. But even more telling, 22 of the top 25 companies in the world by market cap are American. So clearly investors all over the world want to invest in US companies. US companies, especially the largest among them, have been doing exceptionally well. I don't think rocking the boat and enticing other countries to implement their own tariffs, buy less American, and develop their own competitors to these large US corporations, is the way to create more US wealth. Yes, the US consumer is the driver that helps make them the largest economy in the world, but upsetting the obsession with consumers all over the world in American goods and services will do serious harm to these companies. The 8.2 billion people in the world have significantly more purchasing power than just the 320 million Americans consumers alone. Add in higher prices for US consumers due to the tariffs, as well as products being more expensive to make in America, and those US consumers, so vital to the US economy, will also have less disposable income to buy the increased number of US goods being manufactured. So with the US perhaps faltering, will Canada be dragged down with them, or can we come out of this stronger than ever? Trump has shed light on some of our weaknesses and decades-old policies that are long overdue to be changed. Removing our supply management system for dairy and eggs that leads to higher prices and waste, removing our interprovincial trade barriers that add to our costs and make it easier to trade with the US than within Canada, and investing more in our own energy independence and exports are just some obvious steps that would greatly improve our economic fortunes. Whoever you choose to vote for, as Canadians we need to hold them accountable and ensure that this intense election campaign results in actual positive developments for the country, not just more empty promises, wasted tax dollars and poor economic performance. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.